Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 554, Laying on Hands, Part 2. We left things off last time with Takata Hawayo making her way to Japan in 1935. Within a year, she'd be back in the U.S. territory of Hawaii running, as she put it in an ad in a local paper, a, quote, absolutely drugless Usui Reiki sanitarium, as a way to make a living on her native island of Kauai. So how did she get there, and how did she end up playing such an important role in the history of Reiki? Because, just to spoil a little bit, Takata Hawayo is the reason why you have probably heard of Reiki, but have not heard of something like Taireido, for example, or any of the other New Age healing practices that existed in Imperial Japan. Once again, we're forced to rely here primarily on recollections from Hawayo herself, several decades after the fact, and due a degree of critical suspicion. That's particularly true because this was a part of her life's narrative that Takata Hawayo had told over and over again before making the recordings in 1979, which served as the basis of her autobiography, and are thus our source for this moment. This is all, to put it another way, her origin story, and so one imagines the tale has been manicured somewhat in the repeated and well-practiced telling. And to be clear, that's not intended as a knock on her or an accusation of dishonesty. We all have stories about ourselves that we tell over and over again, and in the offing, we tend to think about how we tell them and the ways people have responded to that story in the past, and modify things to suit what we think our audience will like. Anyway, according to Takata, her journey into Reiki in 1935 was the result of two separate, you might call them revelations. The first was what sent her to Japan. You see, after her husband's death in 1930, Takata Hawayo was, naturally enough, pretty despondent, and it only got worse when her sister-in-law, Takata Fusae, with whom she was quite close, died of complications related to a tetanus infection. She herself, meanwhile, was increasingly physically unwell. Hawayo was pretty open later in her life that it was only the presence of her children which kept her from suicide around this time, and presumably it was, in order to stay strong for them, that she began a regular practice of nightly meditation. During one of those meditations, she later recalled hearing a sort of divine message, or at least that's how she described it later. Who exactly was speaking to her was, well, complicated. In some tellings, it's the ghost of Saichi, whom she always maintained remained close to her in the afterlife. In others, it's more of a traditional divine presence, though whether that meant the Amida Buddha of her Jodo Shinshu faith or a more Christian-style god, she was always pretty ambiguous about that. And as we'll see later in her life, she was very willing to incorporate Christian imagery or Christian ideas into Reiki to make it palatable to Western, predominantly white and Christian audiences. Anyway, in her own words, this is what she heard, quote, "Through this meditation one night when it was so dark, I heard out of the clear sky a voice that said, 'The first thing you have to do is have health. If you have health, you shall have wealth, because you can work and you can earn. But if you have poor health, you shall have poverty and you shall have worries, and therefore nothing but sorrows and unhappiness.'" Takata Hawayo took this as a message telling her to go back to Japan, where she and her husband had gone 3 times in the past to seek treatment for his ailments at a prestigious hospital in Tokyo. And that's why she ended up on a steamship bound for Yokohama on October 8, 1935. Accompanied by her daughter Alice, she visited family around Japan before heading to Tokyo to seek treatment for her medical ailments. As she told it, the doctors at Tokyo's Maeda Surgical Clinic diagnosed her with appendicitis, gallstones, and a uterine tumor, and scheduled her for immediate surgery. However, while she was lying on the exam table, Hawayo experienced yet another divine message telling her that surgery was not necessary and to seek alternative treatments. And when she spoke to her doctor about this, he directed her towards, quote, "a studio where they were taking people to give them drugless and bloodless treatments." That's her words, by the way. This was a place where the doctor's own sister had been treated, recovering from a coma caused by dysentery. That clinic, of course, was practicing Reiki. Specifically, it was the headquarters of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai, or Hayashi Reiki Research Association, that group which had broken off from the Usui Association just a few years earlier. The Hayashi organization, headed by one of Usui's former primary Shihan, or master disciples, was led by Hayashi Chujiro, and by this point it was the larger of the two Reiki groups, boasting around 5,000 members and a swanky headquarters in Shinanomachi, a very nice part of Tokyo, right next to Keio University and the Meiji Shrine Gardens. As Takata told it, and remember, our source for her narrative comes from tapes she's recording in 1979, so decades later, and at a point where she is trying to popularize Reiki as a practice, initially she was very skeptical of the whole thing. She went to Hayashi's headquarters for its morning clinic where Hayashi Chujiro and his disciples worked on patients every morning. One of these disciples took to treating Takata and was supposedly able to diagnose the exact same issues as the Maeda Clinic doctors, gallstones, uterine tumor, appendicitis, from touch. Takata said she felt intense heat and vibrations from the hands of the disciple and started checking him for hidden devices on his arms he might have been using to produce them. This in turn got the attention of Hayashi, who came over and started explaining to her that what she was feeling was not any sort of device, but the energy of Reiki. In English, which he spoke because he was a naval officer, or he had been, and that was still a required subject for all naval officer candidates, he explained the core idea of Reiki. Quote, he said it comes from the sun, from the space, from the moon, this is universal, and he said the only thing that is different between you and me is we have the contact, you don't. My students are filling your body with life energy, and this is too big, we cannot measure it, too deep, deeper than the ocean, we cannot fathom it. Therefore, in Japanese, we call it Reiki. You don't know how radio works because you are not a radio technician, nor am I, but the principles are the same. It, the energy, goes through space without a wire. Therefore, he said, you have to accept this great force can be contacted, and when you have the contact, then it is automatic, universal, limitless, unlimited power when you have the switch on, and when you want it to stop, all you have to do is take your hands off. Hands off, he says, and it just stops, so therefore, it's very simple. Now, how much you put credence in this story is, of course, up to you. I have a hard time believing this is exactly how things went down, simply because I, too, was a skeptic once is a little bit too much of an obvious sales pitch where I'm coming from, but maybe I'm just a cynic. Takata, at least, apparently found this convincing enough that by December 10th, 1935, she was attending her first class at Hayashi's clinic as one of his students. She was apparently pretty good, too, because by May of 1936, she wrote in her diary that Hayashi had said he would soon teach her, quote, the utmost secret in the energy science. What that means, in other words, is the okuden, the inner and secret teachings of Reiki as a practice. That apparently took some convincing, too, because both Hayashi and a few of his students were initially reluctant to teach Reiki to someone they viewed as an outsider. Takata Hawayo might have been a Nikkeijin, ethnically Japanese, but she was, in terms of attitude, very American, as the whole thing about checking Hayashi's disciples for hidden devices made abundantly clear. That whole attitude of you're not really one of us was, of course, pretty standard for a period of substantial cultural chauvinism in Japan. It's also worth noting there was probably some class bias against someone like Hawayo, because of the Americanized background, and also because, like most Nikkei laborers in Hawaii, her family had been poor when they'd been in Japan. They'd been low class. That's why they'd left in the first place. It was only after a great deal of begging and proving of her worthiness that Takata was able to convince Hayashi to accept her as a student, and you can probably again guess pretty much where the story goes from here. There's some dispute as to the details, the precise nature of the training courses Takata took with Hayashi, but the broad strokes of the timeline are pretty clear. She claims to have been more or less cured of whatever was ailing her by March of 1936, when she was well enough to go to Kyoto for a memorial service for her husband at the Otani Honbyo, the mausoleum of Shinran, the founder of the Jodo Shinshu sect. Upon returning to Tokyo, she was invited to live with the Hayashis alongside their daughter, a mark of favor for any disciple in a traditional Japanese art that marks them as uchideshi, an inner student. By June of 1936, she'd been the subject of her own initiation ceremony marking her as a master, and shortly thereafter headed back to Hawaii, the first non-Japanese Reiki master. She continued working for the Spalding family, her white benefactors and employers before the trip, but opened up a Reiki clinic on the side to serve the Nikkei population of Kauai. Her return to the US didn't end her association with Hayashi Chujiro as her instructor. She'd go back to Japan the next year to study with him again, and arranged for him to travel to Hawaii in 1938 to run his own training clinic for interested attendees, 350 of them, in point of fact. Ultimately, what really disrupted her connection with the Japanese Reiki community was, of course, the Second World War. Already by 1938, US-Japan tensions were pretty high enough that Takata actually hadn't been able to get a work visa for Hayashi Chujiro when he came to the Hawaiian Islands to visit and teach. That meant he couldn't actually be paid for teaching classes, and so instead Takata arranged to lavish him with gifts like, and this is true, 400 pounds of Hawaiian sugar, presumably intended to be taken home and sold, which must have made for a very interesting return customs experience. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, government-led crackdowns on Japanese-American communities were intense. Hawaii was hit differently than the western coast of the United States, where the Executive Order 9066 led to the wide-ranging incarceration of Japanese Americans up and down the West Coast, despite a complete lack of evidence, as repeatedly established in court, that the vast majority posed any threat to the United States. Hawaii, however, had too large of a Japanese-American population to incarcerate. About 40% of the island's residents were Nikkei, of Japanese ancestry, by 1941, and placing them all in camps would have been logistically a nightmare and devastating to the island's economy. So only about 2,000 Nikkei were actually imprisoned in Hawaii, mostly people with direct ties to Japan-based cultural institutions like Shinto priests. Others were forcibly relocated to other parts of the island for security reasons, away from their homes and jobs, which of course many of them then lost. Very likely, Takata was investigated by the FBI during this period as a potential subversive. Her consistent trips to Japan would have drawn suspicion, and of course she'd openly associated with Hayashi, a military officer, or at least ex-military, who had in fact trained his disciples, just like Usui Mikao had, to reverently recite the poetry of the Meiji Emperor, among other things. She was never actually imprisoned, but probably that has more to do with the fact that the FBI didn't have that many Japanese-speaking investigators who could have figured out what Reiki even was in terms of its teachings than anything else. Takata was still nervous enough about what was going on to make some pretty big changes to her own messaging. After the start of the war, she started to change the signage outside her clinic in the city of Hilo. Initially, it had been a mixture of Japanese and English, promoting Reiki by its Japanese name. But during the war years, the Japanese text was all removed, as was the word Reiki. It was replaced with, quote, nerve gland shortwave treatments, a bit more culturally neutral, but also a bit wordier. The war also accelerated a very important trend that had already started before Pearl Harbor itself. Takata Hawayo had taken what she learned from Hayashi Chujiro and started to change it to improve on the Reiki teachings. Probably the best example of this was a trip in 1938 financed by her employer and benefactor Julia Spalding, who was very interested in this whole teaching, to study something called naturopathy in Chicago. Now, if you haven't heard of naturopathy, here is my attempt to explain what it is in the least judgmental way possible. Essentially, naturopaths claim to be able to replicate some of the effects of modern medicine using treatments that are grounded in more folk medicine or spiritual notions of human vitality than rigorous data-based study. So naturopathy includes stuff like homeopathy, reflexology, or cranial osteopathy, all of which have no scientific basis whatsoever. I'm going to be honest here, I debated a long tangent about some examples of naturopathy and why they are all nonsense and often more harmful than anything else, particularly because in the United States, naturopaths tend to be associated with things like anti-vaccine scaremongering that I think are both genuine public health issues and massive moral failures on the part of the people who engage in them. But I'm also assuming anyone still listening to this specific episode in particular is unlikely to be a firm believer in either Reiki or naturopathy, to be honest. So instead, I will just say the shortcomings of these practices are very well documented, and if you do any kind of honest research, they're not that hard to find. In particular, the tendency among naturopaths to advise followers to avoid what they see as invasive medical procedures, surgeries, or taking prescription medicine in particular, that can really hurt people, and it's very irresponsible and morally wrong. If you disagree, you're entitled to that opinion, but as the old saying goes, you are not entitled to your own facts, and the facts here are frankly pretty clear in my opinion. Anyway, Takata's time in Chicago led to a series of adaptations to her Reiki teachings, most notably an increased reliance on massage therapy as a part of Reiki practice, as well as a reliance on the increasingly popular notion derived from naturopathy of juice cleansing. Naturopathy wasn't the only outside influence on her teaching either. By the 40s, she began to incorporate ideas from radionics, another pseudoscience developed by the American pseudoscientist Albert Abrams. Abrams believed all human tissues emitted vibrations that could be read to diagnose disease and altered using machinery to cure any ailment. Takata had one of his devices for doing this, called an oscilloclast, and advertised that fact in local papers in 1940. Very likely, she'd first seen one in 1938 during her trip to Chicago, where she later described meeting a group of doctors who'd developed a scientific device, they called it, to use the vital forces of the cosmos, her words, to treat ailments. She appears to have seen radionics, which I really want to emphasize is not real medicine at all, as a way to offer some scientific validity to her own claims about Reiki's cosmic power and cosmic source, though her account also emphasized that these scientists were impressed by her own talents at treating an injured World War I veteran, and that one of them had exclaimed, quote, "If I could learn this therapy, our own research would become unnecessary," unquote. In other words, her pseudomedicine was better than their pseudomedicine. Takata also began to professionalize her practice quite a bit more during this period, settling on a fairly standard 60-minute therapy session for clients with a fixed price tag attached to it. That was actually pretty controversial among many of her Nikkei patients and students in Hawaii, which led a few of them to break away from her. They saw the whole shift as commercializing a practice that by rights should not be limited to a transactional mindset. Many of them continued a more free-form approach without either a fixed time slot or a scale of fees. One student interviewed for Justin Stein's book on the history of Reiki apparently laughed when she was told that Takata had advised her own students in the 70s to charge something because otherwise the treatment wouldn't work. That student responded by quoting something she'd heard from her own father, a former Takata disciple back in the 30s and 40s, "Kanban kaketara kikanai," a saying that literally means, if they have a sign, it doesn't work. In other words, people who charge for this kind of thing are always hucksters. Takata also began around this time to alter her teaching curriculum by, in essence, de-Japanizing it. What I mean by that is twofold. First, she began to treat training in a more American way. Usui Mikao, Tayashi Chujiro, and their disciples had used a more standard approach for training in any classical Japanese tradition where students are introduced to Shoden, the initial teachings, and then they are moved into the Okuden, the inner teachings, when they are ready. By the 40s at the latest, Takata was no longer doing that. Instead, she divided these two teachings into degree courses that were separated not by a determination from the master that you are ready, but by a fee. You had to pay to attend, you had to take a course that lasted around 5 days, and then after that point, you would be initiated and told you had mastered into the next level. That's of course a much more American approach, both in terms of the relatively short duration and the very upfront pay-to-play aspect, both of which would be considered very crass by the standard of most traditional Japanese arts. The other side of this was a gradual move in the teaching away from anything that smacked too much of Japanese religion in particular. Of course, the language was already shifting. You see this in the move away from Shoden Okuden to first or second degree, for example. But that's far from the only way this manifested. For example, previous iterations of Reiki had emphasized morning and evening meditation, usually involving the recitation in Japanese of the so-called Gokai, or 5 principles, coined by Usui Mikao. We talked about these last week. Takata appears to have discontinued that meditation training and that recitation practice. None of her students from this period mention it in their recollections. Likely that was a tactical decision as much as anything else, brought on by wartime necessity. One of the few groups of Nikkei Hawaiians who were rounded up and imprisoned in fairly large numbers by the US government during World War II were religious leaders, and so avoiding anything that smacked too much of religion during this period made sense. It's also worth noting that among the Nikkei community in Hawaii and the West Coast, there was a gradual shift during this time away from Japanese religion. Second-generation immigrants and beyond were far more likely to be culturally assimilated into American culture than their issei or first-generation parents, and thus more likely, among other things, to convert to Christianity, or at least no longer be actively Buddhist or Shinto. Similarly, Takata moved away from the model of group membership used by Usui and Hayashi back in Japan during the war years. Those older groups had relied on a model of perpetual training and supervision by a master who also held regular Reijukai, bestowal ceremonies, where the master would transfer the energy of Reiki to their students. This had actually been one of the objections raised against Takata becoming a student of Hayashi in the first place. How could she be recharged in this way if she was in Hawaii all the time? Takata, perhaps because she genuinely believed this, perhaps to avoid limiting her student pool, changed the model completely. Instead, a student would pay for their initiation course, receive their initiation ceremony at the end of it, and then be told that their access to Reiki did not need to be recharged, it would last in perpetuity as long as they comported themselves correctly. That correct comportment also came to be increasingly emphasized. Takata began to emphasize a theology for Reiki, for lack of a better word, somewhat familiar to anyone who's heard of the prosperity gospel in Christianity. This is the notion that faith, in essence, leads to success, that Reiki practice was not just useful for healing, but it was about a general attitude, a positivity towards the universe, and a tuning towards its desires for you in such a way as to make your own success in life in general more likely. Very likely this was an influence from prosperity gospel Christianity in Hawaii, but to be fair, plenty of Japanese movements she'd been exposed to back in Japan espoused similar ideas. Most prominent among these was Seicho no Ie, or the House of Life. The name of the founder of that new religious movement and the address of his publisher appear in Takata's diaries from her time in Japan, so it's pretty clear she was at least interested in this new religion and may have borrowed some of her ideas from it. The effect of all of these changes was that by the end of the Second World War, Reiki, as Takata practiced, looked very different from what it had been before the war. After the war's end, in turn, Takata found that her new approach to these teachings could actually gain some currency on the American mainland. This was probably helped by the fact that, starting around this point, Takata's brand of Reiki became the only brand of Reiki. You see, while the Usui and Hayashi associations in Japan were of decent size before the war, they were never big. Again, Hayashi's was the larger, and it only had 5,000 active members at most. The war was devastating for membership, both financially, who could afford to pay dues during a time like that, and quite literally, because remember, many of the earliest backers of Reiki in Japan had been military officers who died in the conflict. Hayashi Chujiro himself committed suicide slightly before the war for unclear reasons. His wife did take over in his absence, but she was never able to guide the association to much success. The Usui Association, meanwhile, appears to have largely faded from existence by the 1950s, as the war and then post-war economic slump drove its members towards more immediate concerns around personal survival than spiritual improvement, at least those members who'd survived. As a result, within Japan proper, Reiki, as well as many other New Age practices from the pre-war period, functionally ceased to exist. It wouldn't be until the 1970s that Takata's own students, looking for a more authentic connection to the original Reiki, would actually bring the idea back to Japan. Today, there are various groups claiming to teach either Usui or Hayashi-style Reiki, but from what I can determine, these are mostly reconstructions, rather than a result of a direct lineage of transmission in the original intended format. The reality is that most of the chains of Reiki instruction that go back to Usui Mikao connect through Takata Hawayo, and that's why, in a sense, she's the most important figure in Reiki's history. So how was Takata able to strike it so big in the continental US after the war? And how was she able to become the central figure in Reiki practice? Well, as we've already seen, she's already adapted her theology by the end of World War II to fit a more Americanized mold. Her teaching style as well has become more American. However, there's one more ingredient to her success. She was very successful at connecting with influential people who in turn could boost the profile of her teachings. Among her earliest American disciples was none other than Doris Duke, the only child of James Buchanan Duke, the owner of the American Tobacco Company. If you've heard of Doris Duke, you probably know her as a wealthy socialite and philanthropist. After her death in 1993, she left her substantial fortune entirely to charity, but she was also a huge lover of Hawaii and lived there for much of her life in a huge estate which she called Shangri-La, and somewhat problematically filled with vaguely Orientalist designs. It's not quite clear when Duke first met Takata, but certainly by 1952 the two were exchanging letters, in one of which Duke mentioned, quote, "I am looking forward to seeing you this summer and taking my second degree." At a minimum, Duke financed a resort Takata opened in La Quinta, California in 1957 to offer Reiki treatments, and also paid for at least one fairly lengthy trip to Asia in that same year. Through Doris Duke, Takata also met Barbara Hutton, the heiress of the Woolworth family, and the Montreal stage actress Rosanna Todd, both of whom in turn helped introduce Takata to the small world of the wealthy and elite, particularly in California, where they both lived full-time. And of course, the ability to find clients among the rich and famous was, in terms of making a living and making a name for yourself, pretty useful. Of course, today Reiki is not just a practice of the elite, and around this time it started to find its way into the homes of the American middle class as well. Justin Stein identifies the first or at least earliest members of the white middle class to embrace Reiki as a family called the Ventos from none other than the fabulous city of Bremerton, Washington, now and then a pretty important naval base not that far from Seattle. Specifically, in 1941, one Esther Vento, whose husband was a sailor aboard the USS Pensacola, traveled to Hawaii and heard from a family friend about Takata and her treatments. Esther Vento had recently been diagnosed with leukemia and decided to investigate this alternative treatment and ended up doing daily treatments with Takata, who, thanks to the war, didn't have many clients during this time. Vento would eventually pay for the first-degree training course so she could treat herself and returned the next year for further training, eventually convincing no less than 41 friends to come along to Hawaii and learn. By 1951, the Ventos were hosting Reiki training classes in their own home in Bremerton, inviting Takata to come visit and teach. The Ventos are not just the first, but are pretty emblematic for the model of how Reiki spread among white Christians in North America's middle class during this time, pretty much by word of mouth. Takata's new approach to training, meanwhile, proved very effective for these kind of people. All you had to do was commit some money and a few days of your time, rather than signing up for a sort of long-form apprenticeship in the model of pre-war Japan. Of course, this all had one interesting unintended side effect. The 1950s were a period of both legal and informal segregation, and as a result, it was mostly just white people who were hearing about Reiki. The vast majority of Takata Hawayo's students were white Christians, and Takata herself appears to have been very aware of this and consciously adjusted what she was teaching to match what she thought her white students would want. By the 50s, she was consciously playing up the idea that Reiki was a sort of universal principle outside of religion, a claim that she supported mostly with reference to her growing list of credentials that didn't directly relate to Reiki. For example, she would constantly reference her time studying naturopathy in Chicago as proof of the universal principles behind Reiki, as well as a 1949 certificate from the, quote, Great Sachem of the Indian Association of America, unquote, certifying that she had special powers as proof that Reiki was not something that was just Japanese, but a sort of universal idea. Of course, naturopathy is bunk, and I can't find anything, literally anything, about the Indian Association of America, which leads me to suspect it was a method of conning gullible people with spiritual-sounding mumbo-jumbo, but again, maybe I'm just a cynic. Similarly, Takata also played up aspects of both Reiki and her own life story to appeal specifically to Christians. This is when she first began telling tales of the miraculous story of her birth that we discussed last week and made great hay of being born on Christmas Eve. And of course, healing miracles in the Christian tradition are commonly associated with Jesus, and Takata very deliberately played this up as well, and in the offing appears to have been the one who made some additions to the story of Reiki's own founding. She appears to be the source of the suggestion that Usui Mikao had been associated with the Christian-affiliated Doshisha University, and appears to have completely invented a story about Usui wanting to find the source of the power of many of history's great faith healers, including Jesus himself. In her teaching, she would describe Reiki as coming from a supreme being, referenced with masculine pronouns, deliberately avoiding the word God, of course, but very evocative of the concept. Similarly, in some of her books, she rewrote Usui's 5 principles, or Gokai, into language reminiscent of the King James Bible. For example, the first 2 being, "Just for today thou shalt not anger," and "Just for today thou shalt not worry." Very referential, of course, of the King James language of the 10 Commandments. The final aspect of Takata's Reiki boom in the post-war USA was her talent as a storyteller. Every account I can find from someone who met her emphasizes her personal charisma and especially her ability to tell a good story. Justin Stein gives one good example. Takata would constantly repeat a narrative about an interaction with the president of the American Medical Association whom she claimed she met in Hawaii in 1954. According to this narrative, said president asked Takata for a forum about Reiki to ask questions about it, a forum which 43 of her students heard about and decided to crash to give her moral support. Takata, so she claims, then answered questions from the president of the AMA until 1:30 in the morning, culminating in an impassioned defense of Reiki as a healing art that ended in the literal president of the American Medical Association, I can't stress this enough, exclaiming, "You have said the truth, this is absolutely the truth," and asking her for help with his back pain. Now, this story is a complete fabrication from what I can tell. In 1954, the president of the AMA would either have been Dr. Edward J. McCormick or Dr. Walter B. Martin. The term of office rotated that year, neither of whom, from what I can tell, ever spent regular time in Hawaii, neither of whom, despite living for several more years after their presidencies ended, ever spoke about Reiki at all, let alone in a positive light, and trust me, I spent about an hour looking, just to be sure. Of course, if you're not a cynical historian like me, you might not look, and a story like that might sound very persuasive. Now, from this point on, I'm not going to bother going through the rest of Takata's life because, frankly, from an academic perspective, I don't think it's that interesting. If you are a Reiki believer, the ins and outs of the practice are doubtless very intriguing, but from a historical perspective, what matters here is that by the 50s, Takata had successfully transformed what she was teaching into something that appealed, and continues to appeal, to middle-class Americans, predominantly white ones, making Reiki into what it is today. She would continue to play this role until her own death in 1980. Today, there are many different competing streams of practice connected to her, but the diffuse nature of how she approached teaching, handing out certifications but not requiring any sort of long-term association, meant her teachings began to diffuse even before she died, and so today there is no singular Takata school. All of this is interesting, of course, for a few reasons. First, as Justin Stein points out, it illustrates how an idea like Reiki can both be transmitted across the Pacific Ocean from Japan to the US and transformed in the offing. Despite us thinking of Japan and America as separate units politically, culturally, and so on, they are connected in various ways in terms of diaspora communities, cultural exchange, all of that allow for this interplay and transmission. But that's all very academic, and I imagine there are more pressing questions many of you have. First, of course, is the question of Takata Hawayo's own motivation, and to a lesser extent, that of other Reiki believers like Hayashi Chujiro or Usui Mikao himself. Were they frauds? Were they true believers? Were they something else? I don't think this question has an actual answer, which is probably the most unsatisfying thing I could say, but there you have it. Certainly, I, a cynic about these things, have plenty I could point to in terms of Takata modifying her message and approach in order to, one could argue, sell what she was doing to as many people as possible and make as much money as possible, in a way that enabled anyone who was willing to pay her to buy in. Certainly that at least looks pretty crass. But you could easily interpret that as her wanting to spread this very meaningful teaching as far and wide as possible. Similarly, there's clearly some aspects of her own life that she exaggerated, like the story I just told you about the president of the AMA, or that one could interpret very uncharitably. Or we could note that people tend to exaggerate their lives in the telling. I do think you have a responsibility when you make yourself into a public figure like she did to be cautious about that tendency, but that's a private moral position that I hold. It's not a universal one. So simply put, I don't know that you can really evaluate Takata either way in a definitive sense. How you interpret her life, who she was, what her motivations were, what the motivations of other Reiki leaders were, really depends on the prior positions, the prior assumptions you hold coming into the story about whether all of this is bunk or not in the first place. Speaking of which, that's the next question. Is this bunk? Is it not? Why would anyone believe this stuff? Because, to be clear, there is no evidence from a scientific perspective that Reiki works. There is just a bunch of anecdotes, and again, the plural of anecdotes is not data. Hearing a bunch of stories from your friends about how this totally made them feel better is not the same thing as a real medical study. No medical studies have ever suggested there's anything effective about Reiki. The scant pieces of evidence that sometimes believers point to as a way to prove that Reiki is real, like a 2017 survey that suggested Reiki is more effective than placebos, fall apart when you look at them in any degree of depth. For example, that oft-cited study from 2017 was, when you dig into it, published in a highly suspect journal devoted to alternative medicine, not a peer-reviewed medical journal, and was written by a chemical engineer turned Reiki master who didn't even thoroughly survey the existing literature on the subject, which is a crucial and very standard academic practice for any discipline. He also ended the paper by thanking his own Reiki masters, not exactly what you would call a neutral outside observer. And yet there are legions of people who swear this thing works for them, and that's not anything new, judging by Takata's own career, so what gives? Here again, I don't think there's a definitive answer. I don't think this is a historical question. I have a thought about this, and to give credit where it's due, my thinking here comes at least in part from an excellent article in The Atlantic by Jordan Kisner, but to be clear, this is just my opinion as a person who thinks of myself as reasonably well educated, but it's not a scientific thing I can validate. It's not a historically backed opinion. It just fits with my assessment of how I see this playing out. Anyway, it's something of a truism that modern medicine is not always the best at making people feel seen and cared for. Doctors, nurses, overworked constantly, don't have much time or energy for helping people feel seen or empathizing with them when they're really scared and not feeling well. They just need to figure out a treatment and move on to the next case. To be clear, there is nothing wrong with that. Doctors and nurses are doing the best they can in a rough situation. But from a patient perspective, it can feel very alienating, particularly when, again, you're unwell and presumably kind of scared. And one thing Reiki and practices like it are very good at is making people feel seen. After all, there is nothing on a fundamental level more connecting between people than touch, right? There does even appear to be some sort of link between a positive mental state like the one brought on by feeling seen by those around you and your health. So maybe the magic of Reiki is just making people feel seen, making them feel like they matter. Of course, that would imply the formal system of Reiki is itself complete nonsense, and that you could get the same effect by merely, say, having supportive friends who are there for you in a crisis. But you can believe what you want. So this is a hard story to end, in a lot of ways. Did we spend 2 weeks on the history of an elaborate con separating the sick and gullible from their money? Or on well-meaning but mistaken people who tried to systematize approaches for showing empathy to the unwell? Or something else altogether? I certainly know what I think, but in the end, as always, the ultimate responsibility is on you to make up your own mind. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. For more about this show, go to facingbackward.com. You can also support the show on Patreon. Special thanks to new patrons Nancy and Edward for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for something very, very different, thankfully. The relationship between Shinto and the government during the imperial period, and in particular, the start of a multi-part series on the role Shinto played in the overseas Japanese colonial empire.